Greetings, comrades! The collapse of the Soviet Union, as Vladimir Putin once put it, is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And like any catastrophe, it had its preconditions. Today, looking back, it is very easy to see how the great country walked confidently towards its collapse. In fact, I made a whole video about it. Among the causes of this geopolitical catastrophe, many point to the technological catastrophe that preceded it, that the horrifying incident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was a strong impetus for the country's downfall. Sounds rather far-fetched, don't you think? But what if I told you that Chernobyl accident was not the only major man-made disaster of the late USSR? That in the second half of the 80s in the Soviet Union, every year, trains blew up, ships sank, nuclear submarines and reactors exploded under the most unbelievable circumstances. Could these extraordinary accidents, accompanied by numerous human casualties, which never happened before or after with such regularity and intensity, really have contributed to the collapse of the USSR? Let's look at the years from 1979 to 1989. The decade of great man-made disasters. Let's put our tinfoil hats aside for a while, guys. By no means do I want to present here a conspiracy theory according to which some powerful forces organized major man-made disasters in the Soviet Union year after year, with the sole purpose of ruining the great country. You know, shit really happens. So there will be no natural disasters in this list. No one is really immune from such things. All the events we are going to talk about today have some common distinguishing features. Absolutely inexplicable and unbelievable circumstances and coincidences that led to tragedies. In each case, completely different, but each time truly unbelievable. And each time there is one key element without which these tragedies would not have happened. Human negligence.
3 июня в 23 часа 14 минут.
Those who closely follow Soviet history may have one particular question. Why did I single out the 1980s for my coverage? As you know, it was not customary to talk openly about accidents and disasters, especially man-made ones in the Soviet Union. Information about the events, their causes and the number of people killed or injured was almost always concealed. Thankfully, in the absence of the internet and other fast means of communication, it was relatively easy to do so. The USSR managed to hide explosions at cosmodromes, a massive man-made mudslide in Kiev, and even the third worst radioactive disaster in history, after Chernobyl and Fukushima. They managed to deny it for more than 40 years, not to mention the airplane crashes that happened every year and yet were hushed up. Maybe this decade of disasters wasn't so unique, it was just that they were no longer covered up. No, even after the declassification of all documents of the USSR, it became clear that there were no regular catastrophes of such scale in the country before or after that, and certainly not a period when they happened every year with hundreds of casualties. But what did I mean when I spoke about the inexplicable and unbelievable circumstance of these tragedies? You are about to find out. Let's start chronologically. 1979. Two Tu-934s collide over Dniprodzerzhynsk. 178 people were killed, the second worst airborne collision in history. In addition, almost the entire football team from the top league of the USSR, Pakhtakor, was on one of the planes, and this accident could not be hushed up. But we are interested in the cause. How could two planes suddenly meet at an altitude of 8,400 meters? Very simply, they were directed there by a 20-year-old trainee air traffic controller, who for some reason was assigned to one of the busiest sectors in the sky above Kharkov. Moreover, one of the colliding planes requested permission to leave the flight level of 8,400 meters 3 times, and 3 times it was denied. Do you think that's the most amazing thing? No, one of the trainee's instructors happened to glance at the radar and saw 2 dots of airplanes flying toward each other. A minute before the collision, he went on air and told one of the planes to take a flight level of 9,000 meters and the other to rise up to 9,600 meters. To which he received the reply, understood.
735, а вы 9 займите, на Днипrodzerzhynsk 8400 пересекающийся. 9676. Понял, 8400.
A minute later, the planes collided at the same unfortunate altitude of 8,400 meters. The thing is that in fact neither of the pilots heard this last command of the dispatcher, and the answer understood was given by the pilot of the third airplane, who thought that the dispatcher was addressing him. It seemed that such negligence of dispatchers was hard to beat, but some guys managed to do it right in the same year, in Kramatorsk. There, in one of the quarries, workers accidentally lost a radioactive capsule from one of their devices, which then spent 10 years in the wall of an ordinary apartment building, sending its occupants to the other world. Want to read more about this and other amazing cases related to radiation accidents? Subscribe to my Patreon. You think that's the end of the bizarre incidents of 1979? Sverdlovsk. A sudden outbreak of anthrax. The authorities hastened to explain the incident by the sale of meat from infected cattle at a local market. But here's the problem. All the victims lived or worked in a very narrow sector south-southeast of the closed military town of Sverdlovsk 19. And most of the dead were found to have the rarest and most dangerous form of anthrax, pulmonary anthrax, which indicates that the place of infection was the respiratory tract, and it's unlikely that they sniffed infected meat. And in Sverdlovsk 19 there was the center of military technical problems of bacteriological protection of the Research Institute of Microbiology. In general, today the most popular version of this epidemic is the following. On March 30, 1979, one of the employees of the laboratory which was working with the strains of anthrax removed the main air filter before going home, but did not put a new one, leaving this matter to colleagues from the next shift. And they, not finding his note, calmly turned on the ventilation system in the usual mode. The total number of deaths from anthrax in the spring of 1979 in Sverdlovsk amounted to 64 people. Unofficially, there could be up to 500,000. At the same time, the Soviet authorities defended the contaminated meat version to the last. Only in 1992, Boris Yeltsin, who was the head of Sverdlovsk Regional Committee of the CPSU at the time, actually admitted that the cause of the epidemic was an accident at a military plant. We jump to 1983 and the Alexander Suvorov cruise ship. Although even between those years there were disasters that are hard to explain. The fire in Sызrань, when the workers of the railway thought and decided to just launch 5 tank cars with 36 tons of liquefied propane from the hill down the rails without any steering or brakes. Which, as you can imagine, is never a good idea. Collision, crack in metal, massive explosion, 41 dead. Or the Tu-104 crash in Pushkin, when the military wanted to get something scarce for their families in Leningrad so badly that they managed to overload their own plane with TV sets and furniture. As a result, the plane crashed a few seconds after takeoff, and the Pacific Fleet of the Soviet Navy was completely decapitated. 13 admirals, 3 generals, 12 captains of the first rank and colonels were killed. For comparison, only 4 admirals died in the USSR during the entire World War II. But the Alexander Suvorov disaster really stands out. On June 5th, 1983, just outside Ulyanovsk, the passenger ship Alexander Suvorov crashed into a railway bridge over the Volga. As a result, 176 people died. Officially, according to rumors, up to 500,000. At 22:45, the ship went under the 8th span of the Volga Bridge, which was not navigable, and hit the construction with its upper deck superstructures. As a result, the ship's deck house was completely demolished, as well as the compartment where the cinema hall was located. A movie show was just taking place there, which attracted most of the passengers. The only survivors were those who were resting below in their cabins. At exactly the same time, a freight train was crossing the bridge, carrying among other things tanks with gasoline. It was only by a miracle that they did not fall onto the ship and catch fire, otherwise no one would have survived the accident. How did it happen that the ship was directed to the wrong span of the bridge? The ship's captain was asleep before the night shift, the navigator was engrossed in reading fiction, and the ship was steered by an inexperienced helmsman who apparently mistook the tracksman cabin with a lantern on that bridge for an entrance sign for ships. Although it begs the question, how can one see a small railroad booth but not see the huge breach coming straight at you? But in the same year there was another blatant case, which can only be explained not by mistake, but by people's absolutely negligent attitude to their work. On January 12th, a part of the building of one of the dormitories in the city of Kurgan collapsed into the Tabol river, burying dozens of people under it. During the investigation it turned out that there was a large heating main along the river, which had burst. And it happened quite a long time ago, and the residents complained about it for at least a month before the tragedy. However, nobody had found and eliminated the consequence of the breach. Kurgan combined heat and power plant, to which the heating main belonged, did detect a drop in pressure in the root, and instead of finding a hole, decided to increase the pressure in the pipe, thus accelerating soil erosion. As a result, the hillside under the dormitory was being washed away by boiling water for months. And finally, the foundation failed and collapsed into this boiling underground stream. The bodies of the residents were swept straight into the Tabol under the ice and then carried away by the current. The attitude of the authorities to the complaints of the tenants is perfectly described by an explanatory note of one of the residents of the dormitory. Before this accident, we had a constant smell of dampness in our room. Everything was so wet. The walls were black with mold. Water was running in the toilet all the time. There was water along the pavement in the street too. The pavement was always warm. Opposite our room was the laundry room. There was constantly water running from the taps, which went directly to the basement. It was very hot. In the corridor, steam was constantly coming from the basement. Nobody paid any attention to our complaints. Let's move on to the infamous 1986. Although again, even between these years, there were absolutely absurd incidents in the USSR. For example, the explosion in the Chazhma Bay in 1985, when a reactor on a nuclear submarine exploded during repairs. Why did it explode? Because during the repair, a boat burst into the bay at full throttle, ignoring the signal, guys, warning, stop, the nuclear reactor is being opened here. A wave rose, the reactor lid skewed, and the explosion killed dozens of people and exposed hundreds. But still, this atomic incident does not compare in any way with the scale of the Chernobyl catastrophe. So much has already been said about it that I can hardly add anything new. But let's repeat it once again: the deaths of hundreds of liquidators and the damaged health of tens of thousands of people. There is still no consensus on the real causes of the accident, except the generic technical miscalculations in reactor design and ignorance of instructions and rules by plant personnel. The USSR happily shifted all the blame to the plant workers. Perhaps there was indeed negligence on their part, but we know exactly whose negligence contributed to the large number of postponed victims of the accident: the Soviet Union leadership. The first report of the Chernobyl accident appeared in the Soviet media on April 27th, 36 hours after the disaster. While many foreign media outlets were talking about threat to people's lives, and TV screens were showing maps of airflows in Central and Eastern Europe, festive demonstrations and celebrations dedicated to May Day were taking place in Kiev and other cities in Ukraine and Belarus. On April 27th, the main national football match, Dynamo Kiev vs Spartak Moscow, was played at the Kiev Stadium with 8,200 spectators. And all this less than 100 kilometers from the nuclear reactor that had just exploded and was still burning. All in order to not spread panic, as Mikhail Gorbachev said later. However, 1986 was remembered not only for Chernobyl. There were two other catastrophes that show very well the disregard some people in the late USSR had for literally everything around them. On October 20th, 1986, in the city of Kuibyshev, a Tu-134 crashed on approach. The crash killed 70 people out of 94 on board. It would seem to be a rather ordinary story, if you don't know the details. During the training before the flight to Kuibyshev, the pilot in command bet with the co-pilot that he would be able to land the plane blindly, using only instrument readings. Before the landing approached, the commander closed the cockpit windows on his side with a curtain and guided the airliner to land. The rest of the crew cheered him on. By the way, he survived and served only 6 years for it. Or the collision in Semerskaya Bay between the passenger steamer Admiral Nakhimov and the dry cargo ship Pyotr Vasyov. The Soviet Titanic sank in just 8 minutes. 423 dead and 817 injured. Causes? At the time, it was considered extremely cool among sailors to maneuver ships dangerously close to each other, so that passengers could admire the passing ship. The captain of the dry cargo ship Tkachenko was a huge fan of such maneuvers. His crew reported to him that they were heading directly into the side of the passenger liner, but he refused to change course, saying that a beautiful near collision was about to occur. And the funny thing is, he was right. Later, the investigation would determine that his maneuver, though insanely dangerous, should have been successful. The problem was in the other ship. Its captain had set a course and gone to his cabin to read, leaving his assistant in charge. But the assistant got nervous seeing the dangerous approach of the dry cargo ship, and 2 minutes before the potential collision he changed the course slightly, trying to avoid the collision. He chose the wrong direction. The insanely stupid behavior of 3 experienced sailors led to a horrible tragedy. By the way, when the assistant captain of the steamer realized what he had done, he went to his cabin, locked himself in and decided to sink together with the ship. Both captains were pardoned in 1992, having served only 4 years each. Finally, let's end our story today with 2 railroad accidents that happened one after another in 1988 and 1989. And while past stories are characterized mainly by astonishing levels of carelessness and negligence, here it is a monstrous confluence of circumstances that comes to the fore. Let's start with the railroad accident in Arzamas. On June 4, 1988, at 9:32, a train with 3 wagons containing 120 tons of explosives intended for mining enterprises was going through the railway crossing in Arzamas. Exactly at the moment when the train was approaching the railway station, an explosion went off. According to the official data, 91 people were killed and 1,500 people were injured. And here it would seem there is nothing surprising, a train with explosives could indeed suddenly explode. Except for the place and time. There were hundreds of such trains running through the Union every year, but the train exploded exactly at the moment when it was passing through the center of a major city. I had a chance to visit Arzamas, and the locals are all convinced that it was sabotage. According to some reports, a secret train from Arzamas 16, where the country's main nuclear center was located, was traveling under guard, some of which is said to have been killed, very close to the site of the explosion. It was supposedly carrying atomic warheads or missiles. It was just a little bit more, and they should have ended up across from each other. According to another version, the terrorist target was an oil depot nearby, which the train didn't reach because of a small unforeseen delay at the previous station. If the explosion had occurred near the depot, the devastation would have been even worse. The entire city would have been wiped out. In addition, exactly 4 months later, on October 4th, exactly the same disaster occurs at Sverdlovsk sortirovочная station. A train with explosives crashed into a freight train with coal standing on the tracks. 500 injured, 600 houses damaged. No perpetrators were ever found. And all this despite the fact that such accidents had never happened before 1988. One cannot help but believe in the versions of sabotage or terrorist acts. But even that is not all. On June 4th, 1989, exactly 1 year after the Arzamas tragedy, the largest railway accident in the history of Russia and the USSR occurred near Ufa. At 1 AM, when 2 passenger trains were passing each other, there was a massive volumetric explosion of a cloud of light hydrocarbons, formed as a result of a leak at a nearby pipeline. The trains burst into flames like matches, killing 575 people and injuring 623. The investigation revealed that the pipeline was damaged by an excavator bucket during its construction in October 1985, 4 years before the accident. Imagine, what are the chances that A leak will occur, B, due to weather and terrain, the gas will not disperse into the atmosphere but will concentrate in a low-lying area, C, there will be railroad tracks in this unpopulated low-lying area in the middle of the Ural Mountains, and D, an explosion due to a random spark will occur at exactly the moment when not a random freight train, but 2 trains full of people are passing by, and each of these trains was running late, not on schedule. By the way, remember the tragedy in Kurgan, when the CHPP decided not to look for a hole but to increase the boiling water pressure? Same story here. About 3 hours before the disaster, the instruments showed a drop in pressure in the pipeline. However, instead of looking for a leak, the personnel on duty only increased the gas supply to restore pressure in the pipe, making the explosion even more deadly. The operators of the passing train warned the train dispatcher of the section that there was a strong smell of gasoline at this section, but no one paid any attention to it. So, how did the inhabitants of the USSR perceive this endless series of man-made disasters? After all, the 70s and 90s were considered by many to be the golden age of the Soviet Union. At that time, it appeared to the residents of the country that the USSR was there for ages, that it was creating a better future for itself and the whole world. And now, everything around us is literally collapsing and exploding before our eyes. The series of these catastrophes had a depressing and demoralizing effect on the average person. It was, as it seemed to many, a verdict on the country and its system. As a result, many conspiracy theories were born, and for example, in the case of the Arzamas tragedy, several high-rank participants of the investigation directly stated that they adhere to the seemingly crazy version of sabotage or terrorist attack. For example, Gennady Khodarev, the governor of Nizhny Novgorod Oblast in 2001-2005, directly stated, "It was profitable for someone to create public confidence in the inability of the authorities to manage the state, to ensure the safety of citizens. The ship Nakhimov sank, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, the explosion in Arzamas. A year later, exactly on the same day, the same explosion in Ufa, and no culprits were ever found, anywhere. Many believe that the tragedies were organized by Western intelligence services, which had chosen such a dirty method of winning the Cold War. Others accused the country's leadership of deliberate sabotage, so that the Union could be divided and plundered with impunity, appropriating all the wealth as part of privatization. Still, I am not a supporter of conspiracy theories, but let's be honest, such a chain of catastrophes, incredible in their circumstances and uniqueness, has never happened in any country of the world before or since. And this certainly made their contribution to the unraveling of the Soviet Union, which was already on its last legs. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, a huge shout out to Stake221, Steven, Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Berze, Jordan Lamont, Jimmy Albin, Eli, and Petr Illich. See you next time.